We do have Heather O'Neill here. She is going to be talking design leadership. And this is a very interactive course. This is not the traditional
It's a
seminar.
workshop, so
It's a
I
workshop.
went
So please
workshop.
feel free to unmute yourself, use the chat box, answer questions, ask questions as we go along. And
Yeah, and please know that I will probably call on you. If you don't want to be called on, that's fine. Just let me know and I'll stop. But my goal here is to make this as group discussion focused as possible because I think that's one of the best ways for all of us to learn.
for those of you who are new to Venture Cafe District Hall, we are a free open workspace located in downtown Providence. We are at 225 Dyer Street, and we provide free free internet, free desks, space, all that good stuff that you need to get the job done. We're not a co-working center. You don't get your own assigned desk per se, but we are free and open to the public Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. I will drop the link in the chat. We also have free programming that's designed to connect people with ideas to the tools they need to make those ideas grow. And one of those pieces today is a workshop we have here with Heather O'Neill on design leadership. And Heather, if you want to take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So this is a two-part series that we're doing. It's actually a semester-long course that I teach at Lesley University, sort of condensed down for these two workshops. So bear with me because I tend to pack a lot in and we don't always get to all of it in real time. But the second part of the workshop, in the first part of the workshop, we talked about sort of your values and your mission statement as sort of the foundation for becoming a leader in the field of design or really anywhere. And the second part that we're going to be talking about today is navigating teams and stakeholders. And it will be building on some of the foundation we talked about in the first one. It's okay if you weren't at the first one, but just know that I'll be referencing some things there and some activities that some of the participants may have already done. Amy's got the recording, so you can definitely go through and do them yourself after the fact.
And I'm going to drop it in the chat so you can open it up and then watch it afterward.
Cool. Thanks, Amy. So today, I've tried to keep it a little bit shorter, but discussion always can go along. So we'll see how we do. But we're going to quickly talk about some logistics of this workshop. And then we're going to talk about what values have to do with leading a team since we started last time with our values. We're going to talk about why leaders in particular need boundaries. We're going to talk about choice. And then we're going to do some activities, a little bit that will be solo activities, and then a little bit that'll be small group discussion activities. And I will ask Amy to break you off into groups at that time, assuming we get there. And then we'll finish. So logistically speaking, being a leader, in my perspective of being a leader, really relates to your core beliefs, your values, and your perspectives, which means that it's very personal. The best leaders that we love inspire us because of their passion and their care for whatever things that they're doing. Nobody likes a leader who's just like, whatever, which means that it touches on a lot of the personal things in your own life. Part of the goal of this workshop is to help you dig deep. This is meant to be a safe space for sharing. And my priority in creating a safe space is to focus on the comfort and safety of people from marginalized groups and backgrounds. There's no bigotries welcome here of any kind, even if you think they're well-meaning. And the devil doesn't need any advocates. So if it's not your view, just don't argue it. So last time we spent a lot of time defining what leadership is, and I prompted the question to the group, what is leadership? And lots of different answers. And so I wanted to start this time by sharing with you what my definition of leadership is, because that will frame a lot of the rest of the conversation. My opinion on leadership is that it's a bit like the scientific method, and that as you grow as a human, the method stays the same, but what it looks like in practice becomes deeper and more robust. Because my child, who is 6, is learning the scientific method. She got a science kit and we played with water and food coloring. But people researching COVID are also using the same method to do much deeper work. And I think in the same way, leadership has the same beginnings, but as you grow, it becomes deeper and more mature, and you become a better and more thoughtful leader. So for me, at this point in time, leadership means standing up for and choosing what's right, even if it goes against what's easy, self-serving, or popular. And one of the things we talked about that was interesting last week was, does leadership require other people? So do you need followers in order to be a leader? And there was a lot of debate back and forth. But my definition of leadership doesn't require that, because for me, leadership is about who you are and how you show up in the world. And followers are sort of a byproduct of that, I guess, in my mind. So you lead yourself first and choose who you want to be. With that said, one of the things that we then did in the group is discuss a mission statement. You know, what are you trying to do? What's, when you look back at your life, what do you want to say you have achieved? And I think leaders have an idea of what they want to achieve in their life at a really high level, not because they're brands and not because of, you know, marketing reasons, but because people who are leaders want to do more with their life. They're inspired, and then they in turn inspire others. So for me personally, my mission statement is, I'm working to dismantle white supremacy and increase equity within tech. And so I wanted to share all those as sort of a background framing for the conversations that we're going to have today. And within this mission statement, I'm sure you can pick out a lot of my potential values. I'm not going to share my values list here, but I did want to start by talking about, what do a values and a mission statement have to do with leading a team? And this is an open question, so I'd love to hear from some of you. Again, if you don't want to be called on, you can just sort of let me know in the chat, but otherwise I may call on you to answer. I really would like this to be a group discussion, so I'd encourage you to just go for it and say what you think.
I think like direction and as well as cohesiveness.
Mm-hmm. What do you mean by cohesiveness?
Meaning, you know, when you're on team, sometimes everyone comes up with their own personal values. And I think it's important to make sure that whatever motivates them is in the right place at the right time in order to get things done, if I'm making sense.
I'm not sure what you mean, actually, Jason. Do you mind explaining a little bit more? Like, how does that, so if everybody has their own values, and it's important to make sure everybody's motivation is, it sounds like, correct. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, is in sync within you can say the organization's values. Meaning it's like cohesiveness, meaning like if on the flip side, if everyone had their own internal values that were misaligned with the whatever project or company, it would go haywire, right? Everyone would essentially be working separately and not as a team.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I really am excited that you brought that up, because one of the things I'm wondering about is, what if you have a team wherein the values on the team are aligned, but they don't necessarily align with the values of the company?
Oh, that is pretty interesting. I mean, I don't know if anyone else wants to chime in.
In nonprofits, we usually have some work to do. I mean,
Yeah, tell me
I've never
more.
worked in nonprofit. I've never worked for a for-profit organization, but we do. You know, there's a lot of times where there'll be both restructuring, but also vision plans and long-range planning that goes into it. And you know, that's kind of when you see a lot of the leadership change, when the organization feels one way and the leaders of the organization feel the other way. There's a lot of times that's when executive directors and top switch.
Well, yeah. Amy, I want to know a little bit more about that. If the leaders of the company don't align with the mission of the company or the values of the company, why do the leaders have to change out instead of the company changing its mission? Like, who gets to make that call?
The board. Yeah, if the organization is going to change the mission of the company, if the mission of the organization is going to change, usually you see the board doing it. They might be led by the executive director, or they might feel very differently about the executive director.
Awesome. So the board has the power in that particular instance to make that change.
Yeah, the board as the representative of the people you serve. So,
Mm. Oh, so another question. So how does the board know that they're in the right? Or how does the board decide what the people they serve need? Like, what's that dynamic like?
I mean, like the board should be, I don't know, right? Like I think the board should be a representation of like external stakeholders. It's kind of like the government, right? When it comes to the president, like the people vote for the president, meaning like whoever founded the company, whatever process that they're undergoing, they should have like written it into their mission statement, and the mission statement, along with the initial corporation, should have been, the board should have been formulated in that process as well. So I think it's
Mm-hmm.
a combination of both the people who have spoken through supply and demand, right? Actually, yeah, supply and demand, and actually having that product market fit, the capability to sell that product, as well as the board being elected as a representation of the people through the selection of driving, like through the process of driving profit.
Mm-hmm.
Jason, I love that you mentioned that because I have worked for boards that were not representative of the people they served, and therefore, when they made executive level decisions to the staff who served people directly, felt very, very off base. And so, that's one of the things that I think a lot of organizations that work on board development look for. Um, like I said, I've never worked for a for-profit organization, so I've only had experience where the end of the line is like the board of directors who are supposed to be stakeholders or represent external stakeholders. So it's always curious.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack here, and I want to go to the next slide because I think it's important. And we saw this in the last conversation as well, is that when we talked about leadership, there's a type of leadership where like you're Joan of Arc and you're in France and you're, so motivated to do this thing that people can't help but follow you. And then there's leadership where you have a title or a role that conveys a level of authority, whether you deserve it or not. And most of the leadership that we're familiar with, even though we aspire, and when we talk about leaders, we talk about the good ones who inspire us, most of the time what we actually think of as leadership is around roles that people are in. And I think it's important to remember that leadership roles are about power structures. And in the conversation we've just been having about this board, executive, vision, mission, alignment thing, the priority for whose vision or whose mission or whose values is the one that we align to comes from whoever has the highest piece of power. What do you all think about that? Amy, you have a grin and I feel like you want to say something.
Yes, I think that there's a lot of sometimes the person that will have the most authority that they exercise will be the person with that title, but sometimes that person won't. It'll be the person that especially in cases where you have some really popular leader kind of toward the top but not at the top, who really kind of drives a lot of the agenda. And that can be a problem, but then there can be times when, like, I always think about Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg. Like, Mark Zuckerberg is clearly like the public face of Facebook, but Sheryl Sandberg, when you listen to the two of them talk, is definitely like, I mean, she is the chief operating officer, so, but she's the one getting things done. Like, there's a very clear distinction between the way they publicly portray themselves and how they're perceived by the public, even though she's female, so you'd think that people would, female in a tech firm, take her less seriously, but I think people actually take her more seriously because she has this professional demeanor and she doesn't necessarily enter into the same kind of power struggle argumentation that we see from Zuckerberg.
Yeah, I also wonder if there's something of like ageism happening there, right? Where
Potentially.
she's much older and was much older when she joined, and he was sort of like some upstart kid, right?
Right. Well, and he also had that whole like, I'm not gonna take off my hoodie. I'm gonna like, this is how I dress forever. And she came
Mhm.
into it from a professional background with professional, the trappings of this like leadership that we kind of think of.
Yeah, traditional leadership maybe.
Yes, the suits and
Yeah. What does anybody else think? Like, do you see leadership roles playing out in terms of power structures at your organization? Mike, I'm going to call on you because I know you were here last time. All right, maybe Michael can unmute.
What was your question?
But oh yeah, I was asking about do you see leadership roles playing out in terms of power structures at your organization, or what does that look like for you?
Well, there is like leadership roles um, in our company. Yeah, I would say so. As an
Mhm.
intern, there's people that are that are directing me, managing me, helping me learn what I need to learn. So, um,
And sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask you, do you feel like you have any power or any sort of space to be a leader in your organization, even at the role that you're in?
I mean, they always let me hear my input. So, I think they definitely let me give they take my opinions or like whatever I think into consideration. But as an intern right now, I'm not in a really like a situation to be to have a leader role,
Mm-hmm.
like people underneath me or anything like that.
Is that the only way to have a leader role in your mind? Is to have people beneath you?
No.
Okay. So yeah, so we've been talking about power structures, and when we think about leadership, a lot of times it's like you and then you have this team, and the power comes from you at your team, right? Um, and I also think then you get stuck in the dynamic if you're not the head of the whole company, then you also have this dynamic where it's your bosses and they're coming at you with their power. And so it can be really tricky to navigate that because on the one hand, you have all this power that you can point to your team at, um, and you have some authority and decision making there. But then on the other hand, you're sort of stuck with whatever your bosses tell you. And so there's this level of balancing that happens in most of our lives and in most of our positions where we have a little bit of power, but we're not the ones with the ultimate power. And I think that makes leadership so much more important because when you're in that middle place, um, it's a balancing act, but also an opportunity for you to think about, well, how do I leverage this team power I have to get better things potentially from the bosses who can't see it? I think, Amy, you touched on this really well with what you were talking about, where sometimes the board just is completely disconnected from what the people you serve need. And I think that happens a lot with for-profit companies as well, where the people at the highest levels just don't have the perspective that people on the like active team doing the work do. And so your job as a leader is to sort of bridge that gap. We talked last time about a mission statement and the values that would help you get there. And so a mission statement, I said last time, helps you know when and how you want to act. And when you're in that leadership position of sort of in between, where you're leading some people, but you're not leading the whole company, a mission statement gives you clarity around how you might show up for others, right? Your values give you clarity around who you want to be when you show up for other people. And that's really important because when you're leading a team, suddenly you're becoming responsible for them, right? It's not just about you anymore. And one of the things we talked about in the last workshop was how responsible are you for your followers if you're a leader? And I would take that one step further and ask you all, if you're in a leadership role on a team, how responsible are you for the members of your team? And what does that look like?
I feel almost overwhelming responsibility for the members of my team sometimes, and I'm pretty sure that it's much more than I should. However, I am also new at the leadership thing. But even before I was a manager per se, or had people that I was managing, I always felt like anybody newer to a position or younger than me, even if we were at the same level, same pay scale, same everything,
Mhm.
that I had some responsibility towards them.
Why?
I don't know. I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that I don't want to see anybody, lose their job or get hurt in any way, especially when I used to have physical jobs. Get hurt was big. But, especially this year with COVID, our team has been restructured. We've lost team members who've been let go or chose to leave. And I think that was kind of traumatic. So, in a lot of ways, knowing that, if I can protect these fledgling birds who I feel this responsibility for, maybe um, I can keep them employed and keep them moving forward and build successful careers. It's almost like I feel like a big sister or something, but I'm not in any capacity.
Hmm. And so when you sort of take on this responsibility for these people, what does that look like in practice?
Follow through. So, making sure that if they had a task assigned to them, that it got done. Checking in on a regular basis, even if it's just to say, hey, how are you?
Mm-hmm.
What's your workload look like? What's going on today? And definitely a lot of like, when I see a gap, stepping in right away. I think that's kind of more the unhealthy part for the leadership aspects of things. Like, I think there
Mm-hmm.
could be more of a step back and say, hey, let's let John or Jane deal with this. Maybe just point it out in a nice way, but let's not step in and save it.
Yeah. And why is that important to not just step in and save it?
Well, personally, because it takes away from the time that I have to do my own tasks, but also I think, especially in roles now where I have interns and, young people, young adults who are looking to build to their skill set, I'm robbing them of that opportunity to do so.
Yeah. And I think this brings up a good point, which I'm going to go to the next slide if I can figure out how to computer. There we go. Is around the values. And so we talked last time also about having values to align with your mission statement, and values giving you clear boundaries and room to say no. And what is interesting to me about values is values, like your mission statement, are how you show up in the world. But there's sort of a dark side to values, right? You can care so much about somebody not failing that you miss letting them have the opportunity to do their work. And caring isn't bad. Like, there are some values that maybe there's not very much good side, but a lot of values, there's a good side, and then there's an extreme where it's too far. Even values that sound good, like caring. Like, we want our leaders to care. We want people we work with and interact with to actually pay attention, to show that they're engaged and interested and that they want to help us. We like that. But if it's too far, it can become really bad as well. And so I think that's where the boundaries idea and the saying no comes in. It sort of gives you space to live your values in a way that doesn't cause harm to yourself or to other people, because they don't think, like you said, you can't even get your work done. And thank you for letting me pick on you a little bit.
It's okay. It's like therapy.
I'm sure you're doing great, by the way. So why do leaders even need boundaries? Like we know on a human level, individually, we all need boundaries, but why is it especially important, or what's different about it for leaders?
I think people generally, if you don't set boundaries, they tend to overstep. And I think boundaries just keep people focused.
Hmm. And what's bad if people overstep, Jason?
Sometimes I think because we're human beings, sometimes we might do it unintentionally. And it could be to the company's detriment or their own personal detriment, meaning they might, say, oh, I'm friends with this person. And well, my boss is cool. Let me try to create a great relationship, and maybe that boss allows like one slight little thing, and all of a sudden that person views the boss as a friend instead of like a subordinate or whatever you would call it. And I think that instead of I think a little slip like that could just derail that person's focus, because then that person's going to treat it as like, oh well, I can get my way with the boss, because you know what, this is the new relationship I have with it, and it creates this thing where it creates favoritism, it creates all this thing. I just think it's like this breaking boundaries just has this like this toxic after effect, right, that can show up in many different ways.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And when leaders don't have clear boundaries, it's really hard to trust them, isn't it?
For sure.
Like, think of a leader who probably, like, I'm sure we can all think of an example, whether from like fictional story or from real life, of someone who was in a leadership position, but they weren't actually the one running the show. I mean, Amy even sort of alluded to it with Facebook, where Sheryl Sandberg is running more of the show maybe than Mark Zuckerberg. Not having boundaries means that there's a lot that could go wrong. And when you're in a leadership position, especially, you have a lot of power. And, not to be all Spider-Man, but like great power includes great responsibility. And I think that's an important part that we forget sometimes.
And I have a question, so I don't know.
Yeah, go for it.
So, okay, right. When I think about in that same example of Facebook, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, or even in terms of like manager versus leader,
Yeah.
right? I've seen people in, my previous organization where I'm like, man, this person's charismatic, and you gravitate towards them for whatever reason, right? Sometimes it's not even a performance-based thing. It's just like, this person is so good at communicating and in this given direction that you're like, oh, I'm instantly gonna follow this person, right? This is a great person. Whatever characteristics makes me want to do that, or makes everybody else wants to follow. But then your manager, like quote unquote, I say manager, could be essentially in a leadership position, and you may not want to follow that person for whatever reason. Do you think leadership has to do with um like your personality more than performance half the time? Or because I guess I'm trying to figure out that differentiation. Like, what would make me see somebody who comes in, has a great personality, and I say, oh wow, maybe it's my personal connection that makes me say, I want to follow this person, this person's a great person, versus like somebody who is a, I don't know, maybe who's great at performing, has an okay personality, and I might be like, this person's good at leading, but I don't really see this person as a leader, as a comparison to the other person.
Yeah, and I don't know that there's any one way. One of the things, Jason, that you missed in the last discussion was the different ways that we see leadership. And when we talk about leadership, and I asked everybody, what is leadership? I got all these very sort of thoughtful responses on sort of the idealistic version of what we would want someone who has power and control to be like, and why we would potentially want to follow someone. But frequently, leadership is something that's bestowed or granted, like through a title. Um, I'm a professor at a university, and I have automatic leadership over the students in my class because that's my role, is to do that. How I show up is the type of leader I am, but it's not necessarily what makes me a leader in that instance. on the flip side, we talked about another example. My daughter, who just popped in, uh, when she, at the beginning of this year, she came to me and to her dad and said, I want you to call me this other name. Um, and, you know, I don't know that she has any followers, I guess maybe of her friends. But she sort of made the choice for herself to not only say, I want to be called this other name, but to sort of come to the people who are in power over her parents, and say, we're doing things differently. And so my question to the group, which we were sort of torn on, was, does that make her a leader as well? And I think some leadership is granted or bestowed based on title, but some leadership is just about how you show up in the world, which is why I don't think it's always follower based. I think it's about who you are inside, and can you be consistently true to that in a way that other people get excited about, or helps other people see something that they wouldn't before. And so you
No,
almost have
thank
to be
you.
a leader before followers. Sorry, go ahead.
No. I was saying thank you. No, that's a great example. It definitely because I was thinking it from like the top level, but then I'm like, if I think about it at a different level, like the example you gave for your daughter, that's an excellent example of like what true, I would say, leadership does look like, honestly. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no problem. And thanks for bringing it up. Um, this particular workshop is about, navigating your team and navigating stakeholders. And so the focus is at least 50% on this idea of like leadership as a role that you have. But I think, and one of the things that my students and I talk about every week, because they're students and they don't have jobs, and if they do, they're internships, how do they show up as a leader even when the job title or the life title doesn't imply leader? Like college student, nobody says, yeah, that's a leader. That's, whereas like professor, oh, you probably lead stuff, or CEO, or manager, or all these other titles. But how can they as students show up as leaders regardless of what their title looks like? So it's something we explore a lot. um, but today obviously we're talking a little more about team dynamics, and we talked about why leaders need boundaries, and more explicitly, boundaries are about how other people show up for you. And not everyone will respect your boundaries, but the reason we have boundaries is because it's the way that you want people to show up for you. We hear the phrase a lot, treat others like you want to be treated, but I actually think the better phrase is treat others how they want to be treated. So not everybody wants to be treated the same, and just because you like a certain thing doesn't mean that someone else will like to be treated in the same way. And so the best thing you can do is honor each person's boundaries for themselves. And so boundaries for leaders and for humans in general give us space to say, this is how I want to be treated, and this is how I don't want to be treated. This is how I want our interactions to go, and this is not. And then the other person in that relationship, or whatever it is, has an opportunity to say, yeah, I'll do that, or no, I won't. And there's a potential for consequences. And so boundaries are really interesting, because I don't think boundaries, unlike values or leadership, I think you can sort of do that on your own. But boundaries exist in relation to other people, because if there's nobody else, then you don't need to have any boundaries, right? Like you're just hanging out with yourself. Um, what do you all think about that? Do you think that boundaries are a people specific thing, or do you think that you can have them by yourself in a vacuum?
What do you
I keep
think about
losing
having,
people.
sorry, what do you think about having boundaries on how you treat other people? Like, so,
Yeah.
I mean, I always felt like I had very clear boundaries on how I wanted to be treated, but thinking about, and maybe it's that I need help recognizing other people's boundaries.
Mm.
But like in the case of, say, having a colleague who doesn't finish a task as quickly as I thought they would, and then jumping in and doing it for them, it negatively affects both of us, because I'm not doing the job that I'm supposed to be doing, and that, I'm taking away the opportunity for them. But it also, like, it should be against my boundaries, but really what I need to do is reflect on whether or not that's impacting somebody else's, I think. And
Yeah. I think that's a good call. And so maybe boundaries are also about how you show up for you, because it's not that this other person has to do something different. It's that you have to do something different for yourself that benefits both of you and enforce that. And I think the other people comes in as if they ask you or they expect you to do it, and then you say, no, I'm not going to do that anymore. The fun thing about boundaries is that as you figure them out for yourself and your boundaries change, people get really confused by it at first, like people who've known you. And I found that most people will adjust and they just need a little bit of reminding. And then some people are like real mad about it because they're like, well, I've always accessed you in this way, and you're saying now I can't do that anymore. I'm mad at you for that. And that to me is always a big tell of like somebody who's got their own boundary issues because they can't handle, like, it's not about you, right? My boundaries are about what I need in order to show up in a healthy way. Like Amy, you were saying. Right? So boundaries are just as personal in my mind as values. And they sort of, one of my students last week, I think, used the analogy that like boundaries are like the house, and then at like the walls of the house, and then inside is your values, is all the rooms, and you can't get to the rooms without having the boundaries. And so boundaries can sort of contain your values so that you don't go to like those dark sides. So if you have no values, you have no boundaries around your values, then you go to the extremes of all your values. If you're really caring, you spend all your time caring. You know, if you're really respectful, you let respect overtake, or your desire for respect to overtake, you know, somebody being potentially harmful in a situation because they said it nicely. You know, there's all these ways in which any value we have can be taken to a very bad extreme. And boundaries keep us back from that, I think. The other thing boundaries do for you is my favorite word, no. When you are leading people, this can be one of the hardest, but also most beneficial things you can learn, both as a thing to say to the people you're leading, which is, you know, disappointing, but also to say to your stakeholders. Why do you think that is? Or what's important about saying no?
I mean, there's so many things to, I guess, saying no. It reaffirms like your strength to let them know that like, you know, push over.
Yeah. So you should just say no for the heck of it.
Hey, sometimes let them know you have it in you, right?
Okay. What else?
I think it also is a great way for people to set boundaries by using the word no.
Tell me more.
Like, say if they ask you a question or ask you to do something and you said no, that's kind of like showing that you're drawing the line at something. You're like, you're going too far.
Yeah, so it's a good way to communicate what your boundaries are.
Yeah.
No, are not. Did you ever have something that you were sort of asked or invited to do and you didn't want to do it and you just said no? How did you feel afterwards?
I felt pretty bad. I honestly, it's shameful, but I just started learning about like, and actually introducing boundaries in my life. Like this year, boundaries just became, I was like, wow, I didn't know the power of boundaries, you know, which is sad to see, but no, yeah, I think I felt like most people like sad because I'm like, man, I'm kind of letting this person down. But I think generally, like you said, it's for the benefit of yourself. There's a reason why you sometimes do need to say no.
Yeah. So even as you felt sad about letting a person down, how did you feel about yourself and not having to do whatever you said no to?
Oh, I felt amazing after. I'm like, man, you know, I feel bad, but you know, I was like, man, what a sense of relief. Like I should do it more often, but you know, it's that difficult hump of like saying, like you said, like if you're accustomed to saying yes to somebody or doing certain things to certain people, saying no is just like, it's not just the fact of saying no, it's just that you don't want that person to see you differently as well, right? So you're like,
Yeah.
and it's that change that comes with it, that change of dynamic. Some people don't accept they don't accept no very well, like you said.
Yeah. It's one of those things where um, not everybody's ready to hear no, and you risk a little bit of like social capital and potential friendships or relationships by saying no. If you say no, are they going to retaliate? And especially if they're your boss and you say no. Have you ever had a situation like that where you told your boss no?
I think I did when I in my early in my career, and it didn't go so it didn't go so well. I think it told me how messed up corporate America can be. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it didn't go so well because I think that person thought that I was trying to take a position of power, so they sought out to teach me a lesson after that. So
Yeah. And that's exactly what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about leadership roles are about power structures. And for some people, they're really into that power that they have, even if it's the tiniest bit of power over one person. And by saying no to them, they feel really threatened in that, right? There's in an ideal world, the power structures are more for like alignment and different levels of like organization and less about like who has the power. But in a lot of places, that's actually really about the power that someone might have, which actually brings me really nicely to my next slide, which are about boundaries and choice, because you always have a choice, right? Um, Boundaries tell us how we need to be treated. Values tell us who we want to be. And when you have those things and they are at odds with the place you're working or the people you're working with, you then have a choice about how you're going to show up and either basically play nice or burn it all down, right? And so I want to talk first about playing nice. So I'm sh- I'm sure you can think of a time when somebody asked you to do something that you didn't want to do or you felt was the wrong decision. You were against it, but you made the choice to do it anyway. How did that feel when you did that?
Powerless, I guess. Like,
Yeah.
and unheard. Um, and it's when you start looking for different situations, jobs,
Yeah.
or whatever, um, even if you stay with the same company but a different team on.
Hmm. And when you think about how that relates to like the values and who you want to show up in the world as and the boundaries you have, like, do you feel like you were being true to them?
No.
No. Yeah. Did anybody else have a situation like that? Jason told us about when he burned it all down already. So,
yeah.
yeah, the important thing to recognize about playing nice is that it often requires a compromise of your values, of your beliefs, and of who you want to be in the world. And what I find really interesting is that there's a whole host of people who value compromise. And so playing nice is always the answer because that's what they value the most. But for most people, your values align around other things. And so playing nice means that you have to give up some of what your values are or some of how you'd like to show up in the world. Like, I work in the field of user research, and I would love if every person that I talk to has tons of time and money to go and do a lot of research before we build whatever product they're building. And usually it's just like, 3 conversations that I schedule in the first week of the process because that's all the time we have for whatever reasons.
I need a sticky note.
I know, but not right now,
I
please.
really need
I know, but you have to go wait. And so we have this compromise on what I see as sort of the best and most ideal process for how we could be, serving customers and creating the best product in the world. And so I think about it in terms of every time I let a client push back on research, or I don't let them do research, or sort of insist on doing some research and then build it, like we've not had a successful product, or things have gone really wrong, or we built the wrong thing, or no one used it, and it's always ended up pretty badly. And so the more I've grown in my career, the more that I realize that's not something that's worth compromising on. And now it's just baked into my proposal. And if you don't want to do the research, then you don't get to work with me. But that's sort of like, that's the burn it all down choice, right? Like you can just, peace out. But I think that there's a level of compromise that works for us as humans. And there's a level that starts to feel like too much or straying too far. Because you never want to wake up one day and go, well, how did I get here in this position doing these things that I don't agree with at all? And it's rarely like one day somebody walks up and says, hey, do you want to be the opposite of who you are? It's like 1,000 tiny steps in the wrong direction. And so when we're talking about playing nice, it's really about compromise. And the more you know your values, the more you know your boundaries, the more you'll know when it's okay to play nice and define those compromises. And then the more you'll know that you're okay with the consequences of burning it all down, or leaving the team, or speaking truth to power, right? There's some times where burn it all down is the right option. Can you think of a time? I know, Jason, you had that time. Does that feel like the right choice in retrospect, Jason, for you to have done?
Definitely. But I
Why?
know what I know now. I would do things a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say yes, because I think when I made that decision, when I did say no, it came from a correct place.
What do you mean by a correct place?
Meaning, when I said my manager had asked me to do something, and when I did say no, it was kind of like he was asking me to do something that was outside of my role, like outside of the norm. And when I had thought about it, I was like, no, I'm not going to do this, because this goes against what I've been doing for the past couple months, and so and so. So it was kind of like I was compromising myself by saying yes, and I think it was just right of me as a human being and what my values were at the time to just say no.
Yeah. And I think that's even more true when you're leading other people, because as Amy talked about really early on, you, Amy, have a responsibility for all your minions, for lack of a better word. Like, I feel like the way we talk about organizational dynamics is just uncomfortably bad. So apologies for that. But like the people who report to you, you have a responsibility to them. And you also have a responsibility to make sure that they can do their best work and the right work. And so that means that, Amy, it's your responsibility to say no and potentially have to burn some things down in order to make sure that your team can do their work. Because if you were constantly asked, hey, can your team just handle this other thing? Can your team go over here and do this? And it was work that nobody on your team is responsible for. At some point, you either have to find a way to do double work, which is going to burn everyone out, or you have to be the leader of standing up for your team. And so burn it all down is not always just a you choice.
Yeah, no, it's definitely. And I think sometimes you have to let somebody else, if it's their choice to burn something down, do so.
Yeah.
I think will also be hard for me if that ever comes to fruition, because I like to be liked, I guess. I don't know.
It's hard. It's a risk to make the choice to say something that isn't going to be well received, right? We face it all day, every day. I had a meeting somewhat recently with one of my clients, the CEO of a company, and I was like, hey, listen, there are some serious problems in your organization, and I'm not staying because I'm a contractor. So like, I don't have to do this. And I know that you could just like fire me right now. And he's like, oh, I would never do that. And I was like, you say that, and yet not convinced. And it's interesting to see how people like to ignore the power dynamics when they have the power. And I think as you're going through as a leader, thinking about what power do you wield and how do you. One of the questions I asked my students for homework recently was, if you're leading a team, how do you get your team to do the things you need them to do without leveraging the power of your role? And I think it's a good question that we should all ask ourselves. So, yeah, choices really give us the chance to compromise and hold true to our values, or decide when it's okay to compromise. Because there is some level of compromise that I think is necessary to navigate human life, because different people value different things. And it doesn't always mean that one side is wrong or bad. But knowing in advance where you can compromise and knowing in advance where you want to hold true is going to help you make those hard decisions the way that you'd want to make them. So we've got about, I can go till 3, Amy, is that correct? Thanks everyone for sticking with me. I'd like to do an activity of mapping out some of the relationships that you're in right now. And so what I want you to do is to choose either a team that you lead or a group of stakeholders that you work under, and list out each person. And then for team members, you're going to write out what they do and what their role is, where they get stuck, how they best receive feedback and grow, their goals, and how they would work best, and any concerns you have. And then for stakeholders, if you chose that one, what their role is, what power or influence that they have in the company, and what power or influence they have on your work, what is their level of interest in your work, their goals, and how they work best, and any concerns you have. And the goal with this mapping is, if we were in person, I would have us do it on sticky notes and then put them on the wall and sort of map out the larger team dynamics of relationships. But it's really just to give you a chance to see how each individual on either your team or in the stakeholders that you report to show up, and then how they relate to each other so that you can know better how you might show up. So where do your goals and values align? Where do they differ? Who's going to be that really pain in the butt one? And how can you cut that off at the pass, right? Being a leader is about anticipating a lot of the relationship dynamics and navigating that for other people so they don't have to. So I know it's a lot of work, and we can sort of say, go do this at home, because I'll share the slides afterwards. But the goal with all of this mapping is to see the larger picture of your team at play, so you can make smarter decisions in advance about how to show up. And we'll share the slides afterwards. So I'm just going to go on to the next one. Is once you've got your team dynamics mapped out, go through the different sort of scenarios or concerns that you have, or the sort of possible negatives, and say, what's the worst thing that will happen if I bring up this concern, or I say this thing, or I make this choice that aligns with my values, but that doesn't necessarily align with the stakeholder or with what this team member thinks they want. And I want you to go, like, don't go, oh, the world will explode, because that's not really actually the worst thing that will happen. But I want you to think, would I really lose my job? Would this team member never listen to me again? Would this stakeholder sabotage every single project I work on? Would I get shifted to a back office and my red stapler got taken away and I'm receiving payroll as an error? Sorry, office space. Like, what's the actual real life worst thing that could happen if you did something that went against what felt normal or acceptable? So when you're putting those concerns out there and you're mapping, what's the bad stuff? Because if you can confront it now, it might not actually be that bad. I know, I'm totally old, Abby.
No,
It's
I am
good.
too. I just want to respond to a lot of this. That I think a lot of this comes down to how it's approached. That
Mm-hmm.
it's not always about whether one brings up a concern or tries to follow their values. And I think inevitably one needs to find ways to compromise and balance, because we all have our biases. And I think, we have to, there's always a negotiation with others. So you want to make sure that, other people feel like they're winning as well.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
a lot of it ends up coming down to the approach. And so that's where it can get a little more tricky and complicated.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point, is that not all burning it down looks like, tell your boss to F off and flip the deuces on the way. Or although there is some of that, I think that, you said it always needs to be a compromise. And I don't think that's always true. I think there are moments where flipping off the boss and walking out is the right answer. But I also think the majority of the time it's, how can I, realign people? And that's why when we're doing this power mapping sort of idea, let me go back to it. Um, you thinking about their goals. Where do they get stuck? How do they receive feedback and grow? Because that tells you how you can show up for your team members. Or, what are their goals here on this side? How do they work best? Where are they having influence in the company? And how much interest do they have in your work? How do you show up for your stakeholders best? Because you have some stakeholders who are probably really hands-on and they want to know everything you're doing. And some stakeholders who are like, please stop emailing me. I don't want it. Like, brief me once a quarter. That's it. Or flag any red flags and otherwise leave me alone. And so understanding the humans involved, and there's a lot of more detailed and formal ways to do this. But I think that if you've worked with people, you can have an instinct for how they might respond in different ways. And then you can figure out, if I have to say a concern or if I have to share something that they may not want to hear, what does the rest of this information tell me about how I can show up and do that effectively? And that was going to be sort of the next thing we were going to talk about, was getting in groups of two and practicing. And we're low on time, so we will not do that. But I would encourage you to go to someone share a person that you want to bring up something that feels uncomfortable with, and tell them what you think the worst case is that could happen, and then practice telling them and having them reenact like the worst case and be really awful, so you sort of get it all. Like, I think that's one of the best ways to practice, because while there's no direct practice for hard conversations, the more that we try and the more that we give ourselves space to hear things, the less that we take it personally or believe it's about us. Like Amy, you were talking about, I just want to be liked. We all have some of that. Like, I just want to feel safe and secure, and like I'm not a complete like nonsense person. And that's totally normal. And so the more you can get used to the idea is like the way people respond to you is not always about you. And even when you say things nicely, to Avi's point, you don't always get the best response. People don't always like to be held accountable. And sometimes there's no level of nice compromise that will still allow you to bring up a conversation and get to the result you want.
Totally. Yeah. And I've seen this happen, I guess it plays into aspects of negotiation, but I think about my wife who had to negotiate a role, and because she was being so nice about it, they ended up pushing it off and doing other things, prioritizing other things. And then the pandemic hit, and there was a hiring freeze.
A hiring freeze.
And so
Yeah.
that's when being nice and not really prioritizing one's needs and values, because it was related to aspects of one's role and values. So
yeah. And I think that comes back to like, if you value niceness, not having a boundary around what that could look like leads you to the dark side of niceness. And then you lose out on a job because of a global pandemic. Sorry, also, because that sucks. Sorry, Jason, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I had a question, right? So like,
Yeah.
at my previous role,
because like as a PM, a project manager, and like so I'm used to like what you're telling me is similar to like stakeholder matrices, whatever, to like figure out how to communicate with them better and what their goals are and whatnot, right? But like in practice, as a recommendation or advice in terms of me, like, is there a better, like if I wrote down my team's like goals and whatnot, and I know what their goals are and whatnot, like in practice, how could I better go about? Because I've heard an example from someone that says, if you know your team's values, it's better to it's better to like incentivize them or in line or to get yourself aligned with them, right? It's to say like, hey, listen, I know, doing this may help you achieve this, or you know what I mean. So you can kind of like get them on board and whatnot. But like, if I wrote down their goals, is that the same way as because a goal might be different from what their actual value is, right? So do you have any like strategies or tips to one, figure out what their values might be, and how to actually, how to obtain that information in a more personal way, how long it would take, and how to effectively deliver that? I don't know if that's too
Loaded question.
Yeah.
It's a lot. I don't know that we have the time for all of it. My very short version would be build relationships. And I think that, I would suggest that probably within an hour, within 5 minutes, I think, of talking to me, you can take a guess at some of my values. And I suspect that the same is true for most people you meet. The thing that you'll also have to know is that not everybody has spent the time of like actively thinking about how to define those values. So you can't just be like, hey, what are your values? And they'll be like, I don't know, family, or, like they might have things. But what I would suggest you do is watch more of their behavior. How do they show up in different situations? When do they have to make different decisions? How do they make decisions? You can always tell somebody's values by what they prioritize and how they decide things, regardless of what they say their values are. And so I would use that as a starting point. Just, spending a lot of time observing your team and sort of, if it helps you, like write down what you think you saw that day. You can keep a little like team journal of learning just for yourself. I don't know how you think, so I don't know if journaling is helpful, if mapping it out on a big whiteboard is helpful. But just some way where you can sort of pay attention to patterns or look for patterns. And then also, again, how do they make decisions when they have work to do, when they have deadlines? If something goes wrong, how do they respond? Who do they blame and how do they show up in those moments? It's not something that you could just like do in a weekend, but I think it's something that you could start on and build over time, where you might sort of have a hypothesis around like Amy really values thoughtfulness and compassion. And I know this because I've been on 2 workshops with her now. Whereas Avi really values compromise and unity. And I'm making these up. I don't know what you value. Just sort of coming up on the fly, but I could map those 2 things that they've shared in the past. And then I could adjust it based on how I see that play out.
Awesome, thank you. No, you answered my question. Definitely, it's I was just like, is it something I can get like a little chart or matrix from and learn it in a weekend? But like you answered, it's definitely a process. And no, thank you. And that's why I needed to, I guess, clarify.
Yeah, and I think it's something that you get better at over time, like reading people and sort of the subtle cues. But yeah, and you can also interview them about things that are not like you can talk with them and have one-on-one conversations where you don't say what are your values, but you ask other things about how they decided to do this project, or when they made that decision, what were they thinking about? And that will tell you a lot of the things that you need to know as well. You don't have to do this, but the thing I would recommend walking after you've done your mapping is to write out your boundaries and sort of go through these questions to understand how you're going to show up in the world and how you're not going to show up or how you don't want to show up. The more that you spend time thinking about all these pieces, the easier it will be to show up as the person you want to be in the moments where it matters the most. And I think that's the thing that we all want from both ourselves and our leaders. So yeah, thank you all so much.